The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Sarah Williams adjusted her crisp uniform for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her reflection in the polished surface of a nearby mirror. Today marked her first day as a personal guard to Queen Camilla, a position she had dreamed of since joining the Royal Protection Service 5 years ago. Sarah had worked her way up through the ranks with determination and skill that impressed even the most seasoned officers. Her background in military service and her sharp attention to detail made her the perfect candidate for such a prestigious role. However, nothing could have prepared her for the emotional weight of what she would discover on this particular morning. As she made her way through the ornate corridors toward the Queen's private chambers, Sarah passed countless portraits of previous monarchs and their families. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders, reminding her of the generations of service that had taken place within these walls. She had studied every protocol, memorized every emergency procedure, and trained for countless scenarios, but she felt unprepared for the human element of her new role. Queen Camilla was known throughout the palace staff as a kind and approachable person, despite her royal status. Unlike some members of the royal family who maintained strict formality, she often took time to speak with the staff and showed genuine interest in their lives. This reputation both comforted and intimidated Sarah, who had always been more comfortable with clear rules and boundaries than with personal interactions. When Sarah reached the Queen's private sitting room, she found Camilla standing by a large window overlooking the palace gardens. The Queen was holding what appeared to be an old photograph, her expression distant and melancholy. Sarah knocked gently on the doorframe and announced her presence as protocol required. Camilla turned toward her with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She welcomed Sarah to her new position and began explaining the daily routine they would follow together. As they spoke, Sarah noticed that the Queen kept glancing back at something on a nearby table, covered with a delicate white cloth. The conversation flowed naturally as Camilla showed Sarah around her private quarters, pointing out important security features and explaining her preferences for various situations. The Queen's genuine interest in Sarah's background and family put the young guard at ease, and she began to feel more confident in her new role. However, as they moved through the sitting room, a gust of wind from an open window caught the white cloth on the table, causing it to flutter and reveal what lay beneath. Sarah caught a glimpse of ivory silk and intricate beadwork before Camilla quickly moved to cover the item again. The Queen's face had gone pale, and her hands shook slightly as she smoothed the cloth back into place. Sarah pretended not to notice the Queen's obvious distress, but her training had taught her to observe everything in her environment. She could see that whatever was under that cloth held deep emotional significance for Camilla. The professional side of her mind cataloged this as important information, while her human side felt sympathy for the pain she had witnessed. The rest of the morning passed without incident as they continued the orientation. Camilla explained her schedule for the coming weeks, including several public appearances and a private family gathering that would require enhanced security measures. Sarah took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions, demonstrating her commitment to excellence in her new role. During a brief break in their conversation, Sarah noticed Camilla's eyes drift back to the covered table. The Queen seemed lost in thought, her usual composure replaced by a vulnerability that made her seem more human than royal. Sarah had been trained to protect the royal family from physical threats, but she realized that emotional wounds could be just as painful and much harder to guard against. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to understand that her role would involve much more than simply ensuring the Queen's physical safety. She would be a constant presence in Camilla's life, witnessing both her public duties and her private moments. This realization brought with it a sense of responsibility that went beyond her official duties. The Queen's staff began arriving for various appointments, and Sarah observed how Camilla transformed from the vulnerable woman she had glimpsed earlier into the confident royal figure the public knew. The transition was seamless but not complete, as Sarah could still see traces of sadness in the Queen's eyes when she thought no one was looking. When they broke for lunch, Camilla invited Sarah to join her for a simple meal in her private dining room. This informal gesture surprised Sarah, as she had expected to maintain a more professional distance. Over sandwiches and tea, they talked about Sarah's family, her military service, and her hopes for her new position. During their conversation, Camilla mentioned how important it was to have people around her who understood the weight of duty and service. She spoke about the challenges of royal life and the sacrifices that came with the position. Sarah sensed that the Queen was trying to tell her something important without directly addressing the obvious source of her earlier distress. As the afternoon approached, Sarah prepared to conclude her first day of orientation. Camilla thanked her for her attention and professionalism, expressing confidence that they would work well together. However, as Sarah prepared to leave, she noticed that the Queen's gaze had returned once again to the mysterious covered object on the table. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air between them. Sarah could feel that there was something the Queen wanted to share, something that was causing her obvious pain. Her instincts told her that understanding this source of distress would be crucial to protecting Camilla effectively, not just from physical threats but from the emotional burdens that seemed to weigh so heavily on her. As Sarah left the Queen's chambers that evening, she carried with her more questions than answers. Her training had prepared her for many scenarios, but navigating the complex emotional landscape of royal life would require skills she was still developing. She knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and hopefully some answers to the mystery that had cast a shadow over her first day in service to the Queen. The next morning brought with it a sense of familiarity that Sarah hadn't expected. She had spent the previous evening researching everything she could about Queen Camilla's history, trying to understand what might be causing the sadness she had witnessed. Her military training had taught her that knowledge was often the best defense against any threat, whether physical or emotional. Sarah arrived at the palace 30 minutes early, using the extra time to review her notes and prepare for whatever the day might bring. The corridors seemed less intimidating now, and she found herself appreciating the artwork and architecture that surrounded her. This was her workplace now, and she was determined to excel in every aspect of her duties. When she reached the Queen's chambers, Sarah found Camilla already awake and dressed, sitting at her writing desk with several letters spread before her. The Queen looked up with a genuine smile and greeted Sarah warmly, commenting on how refreshing it was to work with someone who took their responsibilities seriously. As they began their morning routine, Sarah noticed that the mysterious table was still covered with the white cloth, but something was different. The cloth seemed to have been adjusted, as if someone had been looking at what lay beneath it during the night. The Queen's eyes were slightly red, suggesting she might have been crying. Though her demeanor remained composed and professional, their morning schedule included a review of security protocols for an upcoming charity event. As they worked through the details, Sarah was impressed by Camilla's thorough understanding of security procedures and her genuine concern for the safety of everyone who would be attending. The Queen asked thoughtful questions and made suggestions that demonstrated her experience with public events. During a break in their planning session, Camilla excused herself to take a private phone call. Sarah remained in the sitting room, professionally scanning the environment for any potential security concerns. Her eyes inevitably drifted to the covered table, and she found herself wondering what could be so important yet so painful that it would cause a queen to cry. When Camilla returned from her call, her composure seemed more fragile than before. She sat down heavily in her chair and stared out the window for several moments before continuing their work. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out on the Queen's face, as if she was fighting between her desire to maintain royal dignity and her need to share a burden that was becoming too heavy to carry alone. As they continued reviewing the charity event plans, Camilla began sharing stories about previous events she had attended. She spoke about the joy of meeting people who were making a difference in their communities and the inspiration she drew from their dedication. However, her voice carried an undertone of melancholy that suggested these positive experiences were somehow connected to her current sadness. The conversation gradually shifted to more personal topics as Camilla talked about the importance of family and the challenges of balancing public duties with private relationships. She mentioned how difficult it could be to honor the memory of those who came before, while also forging your own path. Sarah sensed that these weren't random observations, but carefully chosen words meant to convey something important. When lunchtime arrived, Camilla surprised Sarah by asking if she would like to take their meal in the garden. The weather was pleasant, and the Queen explained that she often found peace in the natural beauty that surrounded the palace. As they walked through the corridors toward the garden entrance, Sarah noticed several staff members greeting the Queen with obvious affection and respect. In the garden, they found a quiet spot near a fountain where they could talk without being overheard. The informal setting seemed to encourage more open conversation, and Camilla began sharing more details about her life and the challenges she faced in her role. She spoke about the weight of public expectations and the difficulty of living up to the legacy of those who had held her position before her. As they ate, Sarah found herself drawn into deeper conversation about duty, sacrifice, and the personal costs of public service. Camilla's insights were profound and obviously born from years of experience, navigating the complex world of royal life. However, beneath her wisdom, Sarah could still sense the underlying sadness that had been present since her first day. When they returned to the Queen's chambers after lunch, Sarah noticed that Camilla's steps slowed as they approached the sitting room. The Queen's eyes immediately went to the covered table, and Sarah saw her hands clench slightly at her sides. It was clear that whatever was under that cloth was a constant source of pain. Yet Camilla seemed unable to put it away or address it directly. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with palace staff and advisors, during which Sarah observed Camilla's professional skills and natural leadership abilities. The Queen listened carefully to each person's concerns and provided thoughtful guidance on various matters. Her ability to switch between personal vulnerability and royal authority was remarkable, though Sarah could see the effort it required. During a brief lull between meetings, Camilla approached the covered table and stood there for several minutes without moving. Sarah watched from across the room, torn between her duty to respect the Queen's privacy and her growing concern for her emotional well-being. The tension in Camilla's shoulders was visible, and Sarah could see her fighting some internal battle. Finally, Camilla turned away from the table without lifting the cloth. She returned to her desk and busied herself with paperwork, but Sarah could see that her concentration was affected. The Queen made several small errors that she normally wouldn't have made, and her usual graceful movements seemed slightly stiff and forced. As the day drew to a close, Sarah prepared her daily report on the Queen's activities and security status. She found herself struggling with how much to include about Camilla's emotional state. Her training emphasized the importance of documenting anything that might affect the Queen's safety or ability to perform her duties. But she also felt protective of the woman she was growing to respect and care about. Before leaving for the evening, Sarah made a decision that went beyond her official duties. She approached the Queen and asked if there was anything she could do to help with whatever was troubling her. Camilla looked surprised by the direct question, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might finally reveal what was under the white cloth. Instead, Camilla thanked her for her concern and assured her that everything was fine. However, her eyes told a different story, and Sarah could see the gratitude mixed with pain in the Queen's expression. As she left the palace that evening, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring her closer to understanding the source of Camilla's distress, and she was determined to find a way to help, even if it meant stepping outside the traditional boundaries of her role. Sarah's third day began differently than the previous two. She had spent another sleepless night thinking about Queen Camilla's obvious distress and had made a decision that could potentially change the dynamic of their professional relationship. As she walked through the palace corridors that morning, she carried with her a small book about grief and healing that she had purchased on her way to work. When she arrived at the Queen's chambers, Sarah found Camilla standing beside the covered table with her back turned. The Queen's shoulders were shaking slightly, and Sarah realized she was crying. For a moment, Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to announce her presence or give the Queen more privacy. Her dilemma was resolved when Camilla sensed her arrival and quickly wiped her eyes before turning around. The Queen's attempt to maintain her composure was heartbreaking to witness. Her eyes were red and puffy, but she managed to smile and greeted Sarah as if nothing had happened. However, the facade was becoming harder to maintain, and Sarah could see the cracks in the armor that Camilla had built around her emotions. As they began their morning routine, Sarah noticed that the Queen's hands trembled slightly as she handled papers and documents. Her usual sharp focus seemed scattered, and she asked Sarah to repeat instructions several times. It was clear that whatever was troubling Camilla was affecting her ability to function effectively in her role. During their first break of the day, Sarah made her move. She approached the Queen and gently asked if she would like someone to talk to about whatever was causing her pain. Camilla looked startled by the direct approach, but Sarah could see relief mixed with fear in her eyes. For several moments they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Camilla walked slowly to the covered table and placed her hand on the white cloth. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she began to speak about the item hidden beneath. She explained that it was something precious that belonged to someone very dear to her, someone who was no longer with them. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her own heart breaking in sympathy. Without lifting the cloth, Camilla began to tell the story of Queen Elizabeth, her predecessor and mother-in-law. She spoke about the complicated relationship they had shared, marked by both love and misunderstanding. The Queen's voice grew stronger as she talked about Elizabeth's wisdom, her dedication to duty, and the incredible legacy she had left behind. As Camilla continued her story, Sarah began to understand the source of her pain. The covered item was Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress, a symbol of a life well lived and a reminder of the impossible standards that Camilla felt she could never meet. The dress represented not just the memory of a beloved family member, but also the weight of expectations and the fear of not being worthy of the crown she now wore. Camilla explained how she had been going through Elizabeth's personal belongings, a task that the family had been putting off since the former queen's passing. Each item brought back memories and reminded her of conversations they had shared, advice that Elizabeth had given, and moments of connection that had meant more than Camilla had realized at the time. The wedding dress, in particular, held special significance because Elizabeth had worn it on one of the happiest days of her life. Camilla had found it carefully preserved in a special storage area, wrapped in tissue paper and accompanied by a handwritten note from Elizabeth about the joy she had felt on her wedding day. Reading that note had triggered an emotional breakdown that Camilla had been struggling to recover from ever since. As she listened, Sarah began to understand the complexity of Camilla's situation. She was not just mourning the loss of a family member, but also grappling with the enormous responsibility of following in the footsteps of one of the most respected monarchs in British history. The dress served as a constant reminder of both the love she had lost and the expectations she felt she could never fulfill. Camilla's voice broke as she admitted that she had been coming to look at the dress every morning and evening, as if seeking some connection to Elizabeth or some sign that she was doing the right thing in her new role. The ritual had become both a comfort and a source of pain, keeping her grief fresh while also providing a sense of closeness to the woman who had shaped her understanding of royal duty. Sarah listened without judgment, offering quiet support and understanding. She shared her own experiences with loss and the ways that grief could manifest in our daily lives. Her military background had taught her about the importance of honoring fallen comrades while also finding the strength to continue the mission, and she drew on these experiences to offer perspective to the Queen. As their conversation continued, Camilla began to open up about other aspects of her grief and guilt. She talked about moments when she felt she was failing to live up to Elizabeth's example, times when the weight of public scrutiny felt overwhelming, and the loneliness that came with a role that few people could truly understand. Sarah found herself deeply moved by the Queen's vulnerability and honesty. When Camilla finally finished sharing her story, she looked at Sarah with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had never spoken so openly about her struggles with anyone, and she seemed uncertain about how her guard would respond to such personal revelations. Sarah's reaction would set the tone for their relationship going forward, and could either strengthen their bond or create an uncomfortable distance between them. Sarah took a moment to gather her thoughts before responding. She thanked the Queen for trusting her with such personal information and assured her that her feelings were completely normal and understandable. She explained that grief was not something to be ashamed of, but rather a testament to the depth of love and respect that Camilla had felt for Queen Elizabeth. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. No longer was Sarah simply a guard assigned to protect the Queen's physical safety. She had become a confidant and source of emotional support. The formal barriers that had existed between them began to dissolve, replaced by a genuine human connection based on trust and mutual respect. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed small changes in Camilla's demeanor. The Queen seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing her burden had provided some relief from the weight she had been carrying alone. Her movements were more natural, and her smile seemed more genuine than it had in the previous days. However, Sarah also recognized that this was just the beginning of a longer healing process. The Queen would need continued support and understanding as she worked through her grief and found her own way of honoring Elizabeth's memory, while also establishing her own legacy as monarch. The following morning brought an unexpected development that would test the fragile trust that had been building between Sarah and Queen Camilla. As Sarah arrived at the palace, she was informed by the head of security that there had been concerns raised about her conduct with the Queen. Someone had reported that she was becoming too personally involved with Her Majesty, stepping beyond the appropriate boundaries of her professional role. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that their conversation the previous day might have been overheard or misunderstood by someone else on the palace staff. The royal household operated under strict protocols, and any deviation from established procedures was viewed with suspicion. Her heart raced as she wondered if her genuine desire to help the Queen had actually put both of them in a difficult position. When she reached Camilla's chambers, Sarah found the Queen pacing nervously by the window. It was clear that Camilla had also been informed about the concerns regarding their relationship. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and both women seemed uncertain about how to proceed. The easy connection they had established the day before now felt fragile and potentially dangerous to their respective positions. Camilla was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled but tinged with frustration. She explained that certain members of the palace staff were concerned about the level of personal interaction between them. While she appreciated the traditional boundaries that existed to protect the royal family, she also valued the genuine support that Sarah had provided during a difficult time. Sarah listened with growing anxiety as the Queen described the delicate balance that existed within the royal household. Every action was scrutinized, every relationship analyzed for potential security risks or breaches of protocol. The very qualities that made Sarah an excellent guard, her empathy, her attention to detail, and her genuine care for others, were now being viewed as potential liabilities. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Margaret Thompson, the Queen's private secretary and a woman who had served the royal family for over 20 years, entered with a serious expression. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room, bringing with it the weight of institutional tradition and established procedure. Margaret's approach was professional, but firm as she addressed both women about the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. She explained that while personal connections were natural and even beneficial in some circumstances, the unique nature of royal service required strict adherence to established protocols. Her words were carefully chosen, but the underlying message was clear. Their relationship had attracted unwanted attention. As Margaret spoke, Sarah could see Camilla's frustration growing. The Queen's jaw was tight and her hands were clenched at her sides. It was obvious that she felt the restrictions placed on her personal relationships were unfair and isolating. Sarah found herself caught between her respect for protocol and her growing understanding of the emotional toll that such isolation could take on someone in Camilla's position. Margaret then turned her attention specifically to Sarah, reminding her of the oath she had taken when accepting her position. She emphasized that a guard's primary responsibility was to protect the royal family, which sometimes meant protecting them from emotional entanglements that could compromise security or create public relations problems. Her tone was not unkind, but it was unmistakably authoritative. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with Margaret outlining specific guidelines for future interactions between Sarah and the Queen. Personal conversations were to be limited, and any concerns about the Queen's well-being should be reported through proper channels rather than addressed directly. The rules felt cold and impersonal, but Sarah understood that they existed for important reasons. After Margaret left, Sarah and Camilla found themselves alone again, but the easy intimacy of the previous day had been replaced by awkward uncertainty. Both women understood that their conversation was likely being monitored more closely now, which made any attempt at genuine communication feel dangerous and potentially harmful to their careers. Camilla was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. She expressed her appreciation for Sarah's support and understanding, but acknowledged that they would need to be more careful about how they interacted going forward. Her voice carried a note of sadness that suggested she regretted The loss of the connection they had begun to build, Sarah assured the Queen that she understood the situation and would respect whatever boundaries were necessary. However, she also wanted Camilla to know that her offer of support remained open, even if it had to be expressed in more subtle ways. The challenge would be finding ways to provide emotional support within the constraints of their professional relationship. As they began their daily routine, both women were acutely aware of the changed atmosphere. Their conversations were more formal, their interactions more carefully measured. The spontaneous moments of connection that had begun to develop were replaced by a careful dance around the new rules that governed their relationship. Despite the constraints, Sarah found small ways to show her continued support for the Queen. She paid extra attention to Camilla's comfort during meetings, anticipated her needs before they were expressed, and offered subtle gestures of encouragement during particularly stressful moments. These small acts of kindness were professional enough to avoid criticism, while still providing some measure of comfort. Camilla, for her part, seemed to appreciate these gentle gestures. She began to respond with her own subtle signals of gratitude and trust, creating a quiet language of support that existed within the bounds of their official relationship. While not as open as their previous communication, this new dynamic still provided both women with a sense of connection and mutual understanding. The covered table remained in the sitting room, still holding Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. However, Sarah noticed that Camilla's visits to the table became less frequent and less emotionally charged. The conversation they had shared, even though it had created complications, seemed to have provided some measure of healing and perspective. As the day progressed, Sarah reflected on the complex nature of her role. She had entered royal service expecting to protect the Queen from external threats, but she was learning that the greatest dangers often came from within, from isolation, grief, and the crushing weight of expectation that came with the crown. The challenge now was finding ways to provide the support that Camilla needed while respecting the traditions and protocols that governed royal life. Sarah realized that being an effective guard would require not just physical courage and training, but also emotional intelligence and the ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. By the end of the day, both women had begun to adapt to their new reality. While their relationship would never be as open as it might have been under different circumstances, they had found ways to maintain a connection that provided mutual support, while respecting the boundaries that protected them both. 2 weeks had passed since the uncomfortable meeting with Margaret Thompson, and Sarah had settled into a rhythm that balanced her protective instincts with the strict protocols that governed royal service. However, the carefully maintained equilibrium was about to be tested by an unexpected crisis that would force both women to confront their relationship and its boundaries in ways they had never anticipated. The day began normally enough, with Sarah arriving at her usual time to find Queen Camilla already engaged in her morning correspondence. The Queen looked up with her customary warm smile, though Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of stress that often lurked beneath Camilla's composed exterior. There was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was dealing with more pressure than usual. As they reviewed the day's schedule, Sarah noticed that one particular appointment seemed to be causing the Queen unusual anxiety. The meeting was with a committee organizing a memorial service for Queen Elizabeth, and it would involve making final decisions about various ceremonial elements. Camilla's hand trembled slightly as she marked the appointment in her calendar, a reaction that Sarah filed away for future reference. The morning proceeded smoothly until they were interrupted by an urgent phone call. Sarah watched as Camilla's face went pale while listening to the caller, her composure cracking in a way that immediately put Sarah on high alert. When the Queen hung up the phone, her hands were shaking, and she seemed to be struggling to catch her breath. Camilla explained in a voice barely above a whisper that there had been a problem with the arrangements for Queen Elizabeth's memorial service. A misunderstanding with the cathedral authorities had resulted in the cancellation of their reserved date, leaving the royal family scrambling to find an alternative venue and reschedule all the associated events. The news felt like a personal failure to Camilla, who had been working for months to ensure that the service would honor Elizabeth's memory appropriately. Sarah could see that this development had triggered something much deeper than simple frustration. With logistical problems, Camilla began pacing the room, her breathing becoming increasingly rapid and shallow. She started talking rapidly about all the ways she felt she was failing in her role, listing every mistake and shortcoming she perceived in her performance as queen. Recognizing the signs of a panic attack, Sarah faced a crucial decision. Following strict protocol would mean calling for medical assistance and reporting the queen's condition through official channels. However, her instincts told her that what Camilla needed most was immediate emotional support and reassurance, not additional scrutiny from palace officials who might not understand the underlying causes of her distress. Sarah made a split-second decision that prioritized the queen's immediate well-being over strict adherence to protocol. She gently guided Camilla to a chair and began using breathing techniques she had learned during her military training to help people cope with stress and trauma. Her voice was calm and steady as she encouraged the queen to focus on her breathing and ground herself in the present moment. As Camilla's breathing began to slow and her panic subsided, Sarah found herself talking about Queen Elizabeth in ways that she hoped would provide comfort and perspective. She spoke about the love and respect that Elizabeth had shown for Camilla, and how proud the former queen would be to see her daughter-in-law carrying on the traditions and values that she had cherished. The conversation that followed was the most honest and open exchange they had shared since Margaret Thompson's intervention. Camilla talked about her fear of not being worthy of the crown, her struggles with public criticism, and her deep sense of responsibility to honor Elizabeth's legacy. Sarah listened with compassion while maintaining awareness of their surroundings and the potential consequences of their discussion. During this vulnerable moment, something unexpected happened. Camilla stood up and walked purposefully to the covered table that had remained untouched for the past 2 weeks. Without hesitation, she lifted the white cloth and revealed Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress in all its magnificent detail. The sight of the gown seemed to provide her with a sense of strength and connection to her predecessor. Sarah was struck by the beauty and craftsmanship of the dress, understanding immediately why it held such emotional significance for the queen. The intricate beadwork and delicate fabric told the story of a young woman's hopes and dreams, while also representing the beginning of a remarkable reign that had lasted for decades. Camilla began sharing stories about Elizabeth that she had never told anyone before, memories of private conversations and quiet moments that had revealed the former queen's humanity behind her public image. She talked about Elizabeth's sense of humor, her love for her family, and her unwavering commitment to her duties despite personal sacrifices and challenges. As she spoke, Sarah noticed a gradual transformation in the queen's demeanor. The panic and self-doubt that had overwhelmed her earlier were being replaced by a sense of connection to something larger than herself. The wedding dress had become a bridge between past and present, allowing Camilla to draw strength from Elizabeth's example while also recognizing her own unique contributions to the monarchy. The moment was interrupted by another knock on the door. Margaret Thompson entered with several other palace officials, their faces grave with concern about the memorial service crisis. However, when they saw Queen Camilla standing calmly beside the uncovered wedding dress, their expressions shifted to surprise and curiosity. Camilla's response to their arrival demonstrated the remarkable transformation that had taken place during her conversation with Sarah. Instead of appearing flustered or defensive, she stood with quiet dignity and began explaining her ideas for addressing the memorial service problem. Her voice was strong and confident as she outlined alternative approaches that could actually improve upon their original plans. Sarah watched with admiration as the queen took control of the situation, turning what had seemed like a crisis into an opportunity for creative problem-solving. Camilla's suggestions were practical and thoughtful, showing her deep understanding of both protocol and the emotional needs of those who would be attending the service. The other officials responded positively to the Queen's leadership, and soon they were all working together to develop new plans that would honor Queen Elizabeth's memory in ways that were even more meaningful than their original arrangements. The crisis that had triggered Camilla's panic attack was becoming a catalyst for positive change and renewed confidence in her abilities. As the meeting progressed, Sarah remained quietly in the background, providing security while also observing the dynamics between the Queen and her advisors. She could see that Camilla's moment of vulnerability had actually strengthened her position by allowing her to access a deeper well of strength and determination. When the officials finally left to implement their new plans, Camilla turned to Sarah with an expression of gratitude that needed no words. Both women understood that they had navigated a critical moment together, finding a way to provide mutual support while respecting the boundaries that governed their relationship. The experience had deepened their trust and understanding in ways that would strengthen their partnership going forward. 3 months had passed since Sarah first glimpsed Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress, and the relationship between the guard and the Queen had evolved into something neither had expected when they first met. The memorial service had been a tremendous success, bringing together people from around the world to celebrate Elizabeth's life and legacy. More importantly, it had marked a turning point in Camilla's journey from grieving widow to confident queen. The morning of Sarah's final evaluation as queen, Camilla's personal guard brought with it a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Over the past months, she had proven herself not just as a capable protector, but as someone who understood the delicate balance between professional duty and human compassion. Her superiors had taken note of the positive changes in the Queen's demeanor and effectiveness, though they might not have fully understood the role that Sarah's support had played in this transformation. As Sarah made her way to the Queen's chambers for what might be their last morning together, she reflected on how much both of their lives had changed. The scared and uncertain guard who had first walked these corridors had grown into a confident professional who understood that protecting the royal family sometimes meant defending them against threats that couldn't be seen or measured by traditional security protocols. When she entered the sitting room, Sarah was surprised to find it transformed. Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress was no longer hidden under a white cloth, but was displayed on a beautiful vintage mannequin near the window, where the morning light could illuminate its intricate details. The dress had become a symbol of continuity and strength, rather than a source of pain and self-doubt. Queen Camilla was standing beside the dress, but her posture was completely different from those first painful mornings. Instead of the hunched shoulders and trembling hands that had marked her earlier encounters with the gown, she stood straight and proud, her face peaceful and reflective. The transformation was remarkable and spoke to the healing that had taken place over the past months. Camilla turned toward Sarah with a smile that was both warm and slightly mischievous. She explained that she had something important to discuss, something that would affect both of their futures in ways that Sarah might find surprising. The Queen had been working behind the scenes with Margaret Thompson and other palace officials to create a new position within the royal household, one that would formally recognize the importance of emotional support and mental health awareness in royal service. Sarah listened with growing amazement as Camilla outlined the proposal. The position would be called Royal Wellness Guardian, and it would combine traditional security responsibilities with specialized training in crisis intervention, grief counseling, and emotional support. The role would serve not just the immediate royal family but also the broader community of palace staff who often struggled with the unique pressures of their positions. The Queen explained that Sarah's natural empathy, combined with her security training and her proven ability to maintain discretion, made her the perfect candidate to pioneer this new role. The position would require additional education and certification in mental health support, but it would also come with increased authority and recognition within the palace hierarchy. As Camilla continued describing the opportunity, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the trust and confidence being placed in her. The Queen was essentially asking her to help reshape how the royal household addressed mental health and emotional well-being, turning what had once been seen as weaknesses or breaches of protocol into recognized aspects of comprehensive care and protection. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Thompson, but this time her presence brought excitement rather than tension. Margaret had been instrumental in developing the proposal for the new position, recognizing that Sarah's approach had produced better results than traditional methods. She carried with her official documents outlining the role and the training program that would prepare Sarah for her expanded responsibilities. Margaret explained that the royal family had been discussing the need for better mental health support for months, particularly in light of the increased scrutiny and pressure that came with modern media coverage. Sarah's success in helping Queen Camilla work through her grief while maintaining security and discretion had provided a model for how such support could be integrated into existing protocols. The three women spent the next hour discussing the details of the new position and the changes it would bring to palace operations. Sarah would undergo 6 months of intensive training in psychology, crisis intervention, and therapeutic communication techniques. She would also work with external mental health professionals to develop protocols that could be implemented throughout the royal household. During their discussion, Queen Camilla shared more details about her own healing journey and how Sarah's support had made the difference between merely surviving her new role and actually thriving in it. She spoke about the importance of having someone who could see beyond the crown to the human being underneath, someone who understood that emotional wounds could be just as debilitating as physical injuries. Sarah was deeply moved by the Queen's words and by the trust that both women were placing in her abilities. The opportunity to expand her role and potentially help others who might be struggling with similar challenges felt like a natural evolution of the path she had been following since that first day when she glimpsed the covered wedding dress. As they finalized the details of her new position, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of royal service had changed. She had entered the palace thinking that her job was to protect the Queen from external threats, but she had learned that the most dangerous enemies were often internal ones: isolation, grief, self-doubt, and the crushing weight of expectations that came with positions of great responsibility. The meeting concluded with Queen Camilla making an announcement that surprised even Margaret Thompson. She revealed that she had decided to include Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress in a new exhibition about royal women and their contributions to British history. The dress would be displayed alongside stories about the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of the women who had worn the crown throughout the centuries. This decision represented the final step in Camilla's journey from viewing Elizabeth's legacy as an impossible standard to seeing it as a source of inspiration and strength. The dress would no longer be a private symbol of grief, but a public celebration of the continuity and evolution of the monarchy through generations of remarkable women. As Sarah prepared to begin her new role, she looked around the sitting room that had become so familiar over the past months. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress, transforming it into a symbol of hope and renewal rather than loss and inadequacy. The transformation was a perfect metaphor for the changes that had taken place in both women's lives. Queen Camilla approached Sarah with a small wrapped package, explaining that it was a token of appreciation for everything she had done. Inside, Sarah found a beautiful pin featuring the royal cipher, surrounded by symbols representing strength, compassion, and service. The Queen explained that it had been specially designed to represent the new position and the values it embodied. As Sarah pinned the symbol to her uniform, she felt the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with her expanded role. She was no longer just protecting one person, but helping to create a culture within the royal household that recognized the importance of emotional well-being and mental health support. The story that had begun with a young guard's curiosity about a covered table had evolved into something much larger, a transformation of how the royal family approached the human cost of public service. Sarah's journey from security officer to royal wellness guardian represented a new understanding that true protection sometimes meant healing wounds that couldn't be seen and addressing threats that existed within the heart and mind. As the two women stood together in the morning light, surrounded by symbols of past and future, they had created something unprecedented in the long history of the British monarchy. A formal recognition that emotional support was not a luxury, but a necessity, and that caring for the mental health of those who served the crown was as important as protecting their physical safety. Their story had become a testament to the power of human connection and the possibility of positive change, even within institutions bound by centuries of tradition.